Good morning.
Good morning.
Pardon me while I get dressed. So Joe, I'm not going to have you introduce everybody unless I put this on camera. People. But if you're with Joe's family here this morning, would you stand so we can welcome you? So then don't do that again. Now you know what I'm doing when I'm back there with my arms bent over the top of my head and down half on my back. So can you hear me now? Yeah, there we go. There I am. Now, for one other thing before I start. Doesn't blow up while we're in the worship service. That water was cold, right, Joe? No good. Yep.
Yeah, it worked.
If you're not awake, you can be. Cheerful. Mike.
Well, we know the speakers work.
If I don't move, I won't make any noise. I'm trying to stand very still. If you want to follow along this morning, we're in Luke chapter 19. Today is Palm Sunday. Luke 19, verses 28 through 44. Section we're going to cover this morning. There's a picture of the city of Jerusalem as it looks today. And that's from the vantage point of the Mount of Olives, looking across to the southeastern corner of the wall of Jerusalem. And that big building there with the beautiful gold dome and the blue paint is known as the Mosque of the Golden Dome. It's the third most holy site in the Muslim faith tradition. Sets on top of what at one time housed the area where the temple of Solomon was built, the temple that was refurbished in the day of Nehemiah at that time, and then in the area where Herod the Great built his temple in the city of Jerusalem. Unlike what we do today in many places, they didn't take their rubble to the landfill and fill in a huge ravine. They just simply leveled off the spot where a building stood and built on top of it. So consequently, you can stand there inside the wall of Jerusalem and be elevated high enough that you can look over the wall of Jerusalem, because they've just filled in over the centuries and leveled the area out to the point that it almost covers the entire eastern gate. which has some significance to the history that we're going to look at this morning. We've witnessed, and many of us have witnessed in our lifetime, inaugurations of presidents in our country. And we've seen the pomp and circumstance that comes with every 4 to 8 years when we elect, every 4 years when we elect a president or re-elect a president, and the parade and the gala that is thrown for the president of our country. In many ways, what happens here on Palm Sunday is the inauguration, or the coronation, if you will, because it's a king. He's not elected, but he's hailed as the king of the Jews. This is the coronation at the beginning of the week for Jesus, the son of Joseph and Mary, the son of David. While in our minds, Palm Sunday has many symbolical meanings, the reality of Palm Sunday is that it's rooted in history. It's a real-time event that has historical significance. Not only does it have historical significance, it also has theological significance. Theological because it tells us that God interacts with human beings in time and space. Theological and historical in the fact that the story, while we read it here and we read a day's events coming to a completion, the story's not finished. We'll see why as we work through this passage. The story's not finished. And while we primarily think of one thing on Palm Sunday because it bears the name Palm Sunday, there are many other things that are of great significance in this short little passage here in Luke chapter 19. What you need to know is that the parallel accounts in Matthew, Mark, and John give us details that Luke does not. My focus this morning is to simply hone in on Luke's account of the triumphant entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, because it teaches us some very significant lessons even for our day and time. It reminds us of a number of things as we work through this passage this morning. So, while Jesus didn't see that view, that's a modern view. There was no mosque there when Jesus came into Jerusalem that day. Much of what you see there was not there. The eastern gate, which is the arches there to the right of number 44, the eastern gate was there. That's part of the oldest part of the city of Jerusalem, that wall. And just inside there, where that beautiful gold dome and blue building are, is the Temple Mount area. In the Old Testament, it's called Mount Moriah. And you know that Abraham took Isaac there, don't you? To offer him as a sacrifice. This area, this little bit of geography, is latent with historical significance from antiquity on. And it's going to tell a marvelous story someday in the future. So the question is, what's the big deal about Jesus coming into Jerusalem here in Luke 19? Well, the big deal is, this is the culmination, this week is the culmination of the plan of God. It's the work of God from eternity past, working itself out in time and space, in history. It has present ramifications and eternal ramifications for every human being. So let's go back and start in verse 28 and look at the preparation and presentation of the king. Preparation and the presentation of the king. Suffice it to say that if you go back to Luke chapter 9 and verse 51, you will discover that this is not an incidental, on a spur-of-the-moment plan. That well, a year and a half before, in historical time, Jesus had planned to reach this point. Luke 9:51 simply tells us that Jesus set his face, and that means it's fixed. It's an old Near Eastern term. To set your face means you're fixed on one thing. And he says he set his face, Luke tells us, to go to Jerusalem. Well, the truth is Jesus had been to Jerusalem on a number of occasions. He never stayed in the city of Jerusalem overnight. Never. He always left it and went over to the Mount of Olives, or on over the next ravine, past the city of Bethphage to Bethany, where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, Jesus' friends, gave him housing. But Luke simply tells us this is not an incidental, nor a coincidental, nor even by happenstance event. This is the plan. This is the plan, and it's been the plan between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit from eternity past. And now we get to see that plan working out a little bit in real time and space here in Luke 19. So in verse 28, when we read, after he'd said these things, he was going on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. The previous part of chapter 19 simply gives you some illustrations of the king's final messages. And so at your leisure at another time, read those, because they heighten the significance of what we're going to talk about this morning. So he's going on ahead from Jericho, which is the way you would come to Jerusalem if you went down the Jordan Valley River and bypassed Samaria, and you went to Jericho and then came up in elevation over 2,500 feet in the space of about 12 miles. You would literally go up 2,500 feet. You go up to Jerusalem. So it's a geographical, not a directional, up. He's going up to Jerusalem, uphill, 2,500 feet. In Jericho, there are palm trees. You can cut palm fronds off of those trees if you know that you're following your king up to Jerusalem. There are very few palm trees in Jerusalem. As you go up in elevation, the vegetation and the forestry changes. So he's going up to Jerusalem. Verse 29 begins to tell us about the preparation of Jesus. What does he do in order to prepare for this plan that he's known about for a very long time, and which he's clued in his disciples and those who were following him to go into Jerusalem on this day, a week before Passover? What are they going to do, and what's he going to do? Well, he prepares for his entry. The first thing he does is he approaches two towns that he's very familiar with. A topographical view of this area will show you that what you're looking at, go back to the first picture there. In fact, the only picture, if you can.
Yeah.
Okay? So, that beautiful picture of that golden dome and that blue building simply tell us this, that there's a valley there. And you're up on the Mount of Olives looking across that valley and into the city of Jerusalem. And that valley is known as the Kidron Valley. And that has a spring at the end of it called the Gihon Springs. That's going to come into play here. If you turned and went back out of the picture from where you were looking at that beautiful gold dome, you would cross another ravine, just about as deep, and go up the hillside to the city of Bethphage. Okay? And if you went down the next ravine to the west of that and up the next hill, you would go into the city of Bethany, where Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived. That's not it. That's it. You're looking at the Kidron Valley there, okay? And that's the eastern gate. You're looking into the city of Jerusalem. Behind you, the first ravine would take you into Bethphage. The next ravine would take you into Bethany. They're walking distance. I've been there. I've walked there. I've seen Lazarus' tomb in Bethany, okay? And you can literally walk down the ravine and up the other side. There's a little town there called Bethphage. It's much more populated today than it was then, I'm sure. And then you're on top of the Mount of Olives, and you're looking down into what you're seeing right there. He prepares. Verse 29, Luke simply says, when he approached Bethphage and Bethany, he lumps them together because they're simply separated by a ravine, a little valley. Bethany first, Bethphage second. And it's near the Mount of Olives, which is the vantage point of that picture. So he sends two disciples ahead. We don't know who the two disciples are. Everybody says it's James and John. I don't know. Luke doesn't tell us. That's why you need to read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because you'll get a clue there. He sends two disciples ahead. And here's what he says. The preparation is very clear in the mind of Jesus, isn't it? There's no ambiguity there. There might be. You see none of that there. He knows exactly what's happening and when it's going to happen. So he says, go into the village ahead of you. There, as you enter, you will find a colt tied on which no one has yet ever sat on. Untie it and bring it here. There's a real danger there, isn't there? Any of us who've ever broken horses, we know that an animal's never had anything on its back. is a little temperamental about putting something on its back. And even if they're green broke, they will let you know they don't want you there. Now the interesting thing is that this is the colt of the donkey. Matthew and Mark and John give us other vantage points of it, that the mother of the colt is there also. And one goes with the other. But the significance in Luke's account is of the colt. Why? Because that's what Jesus is going to get on. Now I watch people break horses. I've been on some green broke horses, and I just happen to know I wouldn't get on the animal. But Jesus is going to what? Very interesting statement he makes. You go into the village, you find that colt there, you untie it and bring it here. In verse 31, the anticipation of circumstance is given. If anyone asks you, why are you untying my colt, and where are you going with it? It's not there, that's the Marion translation. Why are you untying it? You shall say, the Lord has need of it. What's interesting is that we never know how God wants to do it. We can never predict what God's doing in anybody else's life. But even in the preparation for this monumental coronation of Jesus, He has prepared the hearts of the owners to be agreeable, because the Lord has need of it. You'll say to them, if you get asked, the Lord has need of it. And away they go. Verse 32, guess what happens? So those who were sent away found it just as He had told them. Imagine that. They didn't come back saying, well, we didn't find any colt anywhere. Again, we never know what Jesus is doing in the hearts and lives of other people. So, as they were untying the colt in verse 33, its owner said to them, where are you going with that? Again, Marion translation. And so what did they say? The Lord has need of it. The Lord has need of it. Would you be satisfied with that answer? I'm going to say, let's get a contract here. It's $25 an hour for the colt. It's going to be another $25 for the mother. You're going to use it for this amount of time, and you're going to bring it back, and you're going to feed it and brush it down. No. When those two disciples whom Jesus sent answers, the Lord has need of it, they are satisfied with that. They are satisfied with that. What becomes mind-boggling is this. If God has need of a lowly colt of a donkey, and the owners comply, what does He expect of the crowd who's following Him? What does He expect of the people who will meet Him on this journey? Because in this case, the owners of the colt and the colt are way more obedient and understand their purpose than many others at the end of this week. This is Sunday. This is the first day of the Passion Week. And so they untie the colt, and they answer, the Lord has need of it. And Luke simply says they brought it to Jesus. They brought it to Jesus. And then these disciples took off their outer garments, their coats, if you will, cloaks more likely, and they throw their coats on the back of the colt. Now, first thing would be that that colt would start getting anxious and start moving around a little bit. And then it says they put Jesus on the colt. And still the colt seems to be compliant there, right? They brought it to Jesus, they threw their coats on the colt and put Jesus there on the colt. So now you have kind of a precursor enter to the triumphant entry. Everything's ready. They found the colt. They've got it back to Jesus. He's on it. They're ready to go. Now, here's where one thing I want to introduce to you this morning to think about. This is not new. This is not the first time a king of Israel comes into Jerusalem on the colt of a donkey or a donkey. This tradition is rooted in history all the way back to 1 Kings, verses 31, 1 Kings 1, verses 33 and 38. Because as David ages and his time to rule is up, he appoints his son Solomon to be king. And he says to the priest and his advisors, I want Solomon to ride into Jerusalem on my donkey. Now, why a donkey? Because God had told Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, you shall not trust in the power of horses and chariots. You will not trust in that day contemporary army equipment. That's not what it's about. Your kings will ride in coronation on donkeys because they were humble beasts of burden. And the picture is, even though you're royalty, don't let it go to your head, your coronation vehicle is a donkey. Humility, excuse me, humility is to be the virtue of the true king of Israel. And so here we have it. It's rooted in history. Jesus prepares and is now ready to ride up from Bethphage into Jerusalem on the colt of a donkey. Historically symbolic of the humility of a king who will rule Israel. It's remarkably provided. We've already seen those events in verses 31 through 34. Rooted in history, remarkably provided by the providence of God, the Lord has need of it. That is satisfactory for the owners, and the colt, though unbroken, is compliant to the Creator of the colt. It's not a wonderful leather saddle that they put on for the king to ride in. It's their outer coats that keep them warm. Now the trek begins. The roar of the crowd, the presentation of the king, the roar of the crowd. Verse 35 has told us that they put their coats on the colt's back, they put Jesus on the colt's back, and then in verse 36 you begin the presentation. As he was going, this is a picture of continuous action. It starts in Bethphage, and there seems to be a rather large group of people with Jesus. Why? Because in 7 days it's Passover. And people come from all over the Roman Empire to celebrate Passover if you have converted to Judaism or whether you are a Jew living abroad. You come to Jerusalem for a high feast of Passover. And so there are a lot of people on the road. There are a lot of people on the road traveling. And so this crowd, as they're leaving Bethphage and heading into Jerusalem, as he was going, they were spreading their coats on the road. You know Palm Sunday what you see? Palms. Some pictures you might see people throwing their coats down. And as Jesus in his coronation procession goes, in front of him they're throwing down palms they've carried almost 10 miles, up elevation of 2,500 feet, and throwing it in front of him. And then also they are throwing down their coats. Throwing their coats is a sign of humility and subjugation. It's a way of showing they are bowing down. It's a way of showing that they agree he is the king. As they were going, as the momentum in the crowds picked up, people would go in front and throw down their coats on the dusty trail, down across the Mount of Olives, and up across the Kidron Brook, and into the eastern gate. That's the procession. And the response to the king in these verses is very telling. That's the physical activity that's going on. Verse 37 says, as soon as he was approaching near the descent of the Mount of Olives, he's coming down the hill and into the Kidron Brook. The swell of the crowd, Luke tells us it's the whole crowd of people. The whole crowd of people are gathered there. The whole crowd of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the miracles which they'd seen. There are a number of things in verse 37 about the response of the people that you need to pay attention to. First of all, Luke calls them the whole crowd of his disciples. People who were following Jesus to Jerusalem. Why? Because a year and a half ago, Jesus had set his face to go to Jerusalem. They wanted to know if this was the Passover in which everything was going to come to a head. What did they think was going to happen? The same thing we think every 4 years when we see an inauguration. There will be change that will be beneficial for citizens. Now, what Luke doesn't tell you, but what you will find in reading in the other gospel accounts, both before this and after this, is there's one thought in everybody's mind as Jesus begins the approach up into Jerusalem and rides into Jerusalem. The one thing in everybody's mind, in this crowd, and casual observers also, as we will see, is that Jesus has come to get rid of the Roman army. The perspective of Palm Sunday is much greater than our personal freedom. It's much greater than being delivered from human oppression. There's something way more significant going on here. Yes, they were being occupied by the Roman army. They had been for a number of years. And before that, it was the Greek army. And before that, they were in captivity to the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Two things I want you to notice. First of all, they were praising God joyfully with a loud voice. This doesn't go unnoticed. This is an anticipation of monumental proportions. They are not quiet about the king coming into Jerusalem. There's no mistaking what's going on here. The second reason is an illegitimate reason to be joyful. They were excited because they'd seen the miracles that Jesus had performed. Many of them followed Jesus temporarily because they benefited from those miracles, meaning they had their stomachs filled. I find it interesting in verse 37 that if you ask some of the people in that crowd, does the Lord have need of you, or do you have need of the Lord? Which way they would have gone in answering that question. Because as they're all clamoring for Jesus to be king, to get rid of the Roman army, they tip their hand and tell what's in their heart. We want you, Jesus, to do this for us. That is our greatest need. Is it? They were all excited because here comes a guy who does miracles. He has power we can't explain and don't understand, and maybe he'll exercise it in booting the Romans out of our country. And we will be free. And we will get to do it our way, without any interference. In verse 38, this is a normal coronation announcement. It's rooted in history. It's a direct quote from a couple of passages in the Old Testament. One, in particular, in Psalm 118. Here's what they're shouting. They're rejoicing. This is an excited, uplifting moment. They see great anticipation coming to fruition as the king's coming into Jerusalem. He's going to get rid of the Romans. And they're being very loud about saying what they're going to say here in verse 38. Blessed, blessed. It isn't happiness. This is a fact and an attitude of joy. Blessed is the King. What are they saying? This is our King. This is our King on this colt right here. This is our King. Not Caesar, him. Blessed is the King. Now then, the next phrase is very telling. Who comes in the name of the Lord, of Yahweh's name, the unspeakable name. In the name of His name who cannot be spoken, Yahweh. What's it mean to come in the name of the Lord? It means He comes in all the authority, with all the power and authority of Yahweh, God. What they're saying is, the guy on the donkey is God. Do you think many people today celebrate on Palm Sunday the fact that Jesus is God? To many people on Palm Sunday, Jesus is one among many gods. Don't mistake what this crowd is saying. They're not saying Jesus is one among many gods. They're saying Jesus is God. And then, in verse 38, here's what they say. Here's what they say. And it's interesting, Luke uses this term. Peace in heaven and glory on high. Now ask yourself this question. You've read Luke before, because I'm pretty sure that many of you have read the account of Luke's telling of the birth of Christ. Where else do you hear the phrase, peace in heaven? It's what the angels say to the shepherds out on the hillside. Only they say peace on earth. What's the significance of changing the location of where peace is? Because here's what they're saying. God is at peace with us. This is the representative of God's peace to us. Do you think they understand what they're saying? Let's find out. Because there's another response as Jesus rides into Jerusalem. There's another response from another group of people. Verse 39, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. In verse 38, it's a crowd of people rejoicing and receiving the king. In verse 39, it's a group of people reprimanding the disciples and followers of Jesus and rejecting the king. Even on this glorious day of coronation, you know what they're saying? Not my king. Not my king. I don't want this trouble. We've had this run-in before. I don't want the Romans, I don't want this guy to be an imposter, and I don't want to deal with the Romans getting ugly about somebody being a king besides Caesar. You have one group rejoicing and receiving the king, you have another group of people who are reprimanding and rebelling and rejecting the king. Verse 40. Jesus deals with the rejection of the Pharisees. He quotes from Habakkuk chapter 2, there in verse 40. He says, Jesus answered and said, I tell you, it's an emphatic statement. I tell you is there for a reason. Jesus is saying, if these people who are acclaiming me as the Messiah, which I am, if these people didn't say a word, then the rocks around would cry out. Believe me. The Pharisees knew that passage in Habakkuk. Because God calls in creation and the stones of the earth when He says, I will come and liberate Israel from Babylon. And if I don't keep my word, the rocks would cry out. Jesus simply says, if the humans who are following me wouldn't speak out, then nature will, in unmistakable voice. There's the response to the king. And now, in verses 41 through 44, we have the warning from the king. Luke tells us he's starting down the descent into Jerusalem. In verse 41, he takes us back a moment as he crests the ravine from Bethphage onto the Mount of Olives. In verse 41 it says that when he crested that ridge on the Mount of Olives and he saw the city, he wept over it. By the way, it's not the first time he did it. In Luke 13, 33 and 34, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. It's in that passage that Luke tells us that Jesus says the same thing that he says at the end of Matthew 23. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I would have gathered you under my wings as a hen does her chicks. I'm here to protect you. And then there's that fateful phrase in both accounts. But you would not. You didn't want to come to me. He wept. Why did he weep? Because he knew the theological ramifications of the group of people who just said to him, Teacher, rebuke your disciples and tell them to be quiet. He knew the eternal ramifications of what it means to reject the king. And as he starts down that descent, Luke simply says, as he saw the city and he wept, and the word wept there means to cry uncontrollably. It wasn't a little whimper or a sob. He literally bursts into tears and weeps uncontrollably. Because he knows there are people in the crowd who are screaming at the top of their lungs, Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. He knows there are people in that group who are absolutely not followers of his. They are following him because they've seen his miracles and they're hoping against hope that it'll run the Romans out. They've got all the wrong reasons for following Jesus. Just like people today. Then in verse 42, he gives a solemn warning. He says, if you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace. Stop right there. Do you honestly believe that they didn't know what the terms of peace were? Do you think they'd never been exposed to what Jesus taught about coming to terms with the war inside every human heart, whether they're Roman or Jew or Gentile? what makes for peace. It's not that they weren't aware. The use of the word if there means you certainly do know what makes for peace. It's not that they didn't know, it's that they didn't pay attention. People had seen him work miracles. They had one of two options. Either God is with him and he's God, or he's empowered by Satan. That's the two options of the audience of that day. Either Jesus is the Son of God or he's in league with Satan, which the Pharisees had come to the conclusion was true. And he was an impostor. But what makes for peace? If you'd known this day, today, right now, what makes for peace? The issue is they did know, and they did nothing about it. That's the tragedy of celebrating Palm Sunday, like these people did so many years ago outside the walls of Jerusalem. We still do it today. What makes for peace? There's a guy in the Old Testament by the name of Gideon in the book of Judges, chapter 6. Gideon is the youngest in his family, from the smallest tribe in the nation of Israel. Put in modern vernacular, we would consider him to be a nobody. He is insignificant. What could he possibly do? And God calls on Gideon to take up the cause of God for the nation of Israel. In a word, Gideon answers the call, the Lord has need of you. And God displays some great power, and the angel of the Lord comes to visit Gideon. And he says, Gideon, I want you to do this for me. And Gideon says, I'm the youngest from the smallest. I can't possibly do this. And God shows his power. And you know what Gideon does there in verses 23 and 24? He says, oh my stars, the Lord is in this place. By the way, it's worth asking this question. Where is God not? He says, the Lord is in this place. And the angel of the Lord says to Gideon, peace be with you. And what does Gideon do? He builds an altar there and he names it, the Lord is my peace. So maybe the question shouldn't be what makes for peace, but who makes peace. Because in Psalm 20 and verse 9, a coronation line, the Lord God is my peace. And then in Romans 5:1, therefore having been justified by faith, we have peace through. The word through is a little adjective that describes the means of obtaining the peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Go back and read what the people say when the King comes in. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. What makes for peace may be a question that Jesus is saying you are fully aware. It's not what makes for peace, it's who makes peace, and it's me, and I'm here. And the war that we all experience in our hearts and minds and souls that rages on without Jesus Christ can only be satisfied and brought to terms of peace through Jesus Christ. That's the only way. Because that's God's way. It's not a what that makes for peace, it's a who that makes peace. If you had known in this day, meaning right now, even now, the things which make for peace. And he's not saying you don't know, he's saying you certainly do know. If and you do know the things that make for peace, even right now, then and now they've been hidden from your eyes. I tell you to go back and read the events before in chapter 19, simply because on the road up from Jericho, Jesus passes a guy by the name of Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus is blind. He physically cannot see. And he cries out to Jesus and he says, "Oh, Jesus, oh Lord, touch me and hear me." And here's the sad tragedy. A guy who couldn't physically see believes the king and gains his sight. And people who can physically see the king are still blinded in their hearts. Just like today. Now they've been hidden from your eyes. And then in verse 43, in verses 44, I think of the song from the words from Almost Persuaded, from the chorus. Sad, sad, the bitter way. Almost the lost. Because he pronounces judgment. He pronounces judgment. Verse 43 says, "For the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you and surround you and hem you in on every side." I mean, by the time he gets that sentence out, they know full well he's not rooting the Roman army out. He's rooting out another army. An army that they know about, but they do nothing about. It's the army of sin. It's the army that invades and has invaded every human being since Adam and Eve. It's the peace that every human heart wants but won't accept. And by the time he gets done with speaking that sentence in verse 43, they are left with their mouths wide open. What in the world does he say? He's describing the demise and downfall of their beloved city. He's telling them it's going to be sacked and leveled. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. Verse 44 continues on, "And they will level you to the ground and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation." You missed a chance. In the words of Paul Harvey, just as we end this morning, now the rest of the story. That's not the last time the king is going to come into Jerusalem. Only the next time he shows up, I don't want to be there. Because the next time he comes, he's not coming in on a donkey. He's coming out of the air. Zechariah 9:9 predicts the return of Jesus Christ. And Zechariah 9:9 simply couches the return of the king, the humble king, using the terms, your king is going to come riding on the foal of a donkey. Only this time it's not going to be for his coronation. It's going to be for his judgment. And later on in the book of Zechariah, as the king, who's already ridden in once on the colt of a donkey, and his feet touch the Mount of Olives, and the second biggest rift known on the earth, the Jordan Valley Rift, when his feet touch the Mount of Olives, they will move geographically east and west. And there will be a huge valley open up so that the Mediterranean runs into the Dead Sea with fresh water. There will be physical changes to the geography of our earth. And he will enter Jerusalem. And this time, he won't weep, we will. Because this time he walks in, exposing the wounds that are going to be inflicted upon him at the end of this week. They will weep and mourn over the one whom they have pierced. See, the tragedy is, even as then, so now, we miss the significance of what's happened in history for our good. C.S. Lewis said it best. You can bend your knee now willfully and humbly before the Savior and acknowledge Him as your Savior. or you will bend your knee in the future before your judge. That's the picture as we end the triumphant entry of Jesus. What starts out as such a triumphant event ends with the solemn warning of Jesus of the tragedy that is coming. And 37 years later, Titus, the Roman general, levels the city of Jerusalem. Make no mistake about it. If Jesus Christ knew the donkey and the colt were in Bethphage waiting for him, and there it was, and the colt and the owners were submissive to the plan of God, what in the world makes you think, in view of the history lesson of 70 AD, what makes us think that Jesus Christ will not keep his word? He said to those same group of disciples who stuck with him through the crucifixion, the night before his betrayal, he said, "In my Father's house are many rooms. And I'm going to go away and prepare one of the rooms for you, that where I am, there you may be also. And if I go away, what am I going to do? I'm going to come again. And this time, I'm not riding in on a donkey, folks. I'm coming with all the power of God. You can either choose to bend your knee now to the will of God, or you will bend to the judge." Let's pray. Father, how gracious you are to us. With every tick of the clock, you've given us opportunity to surrender our pride and our selfish wills, and bend the knee in humility to the King who rides on the colt of the donkey, who himself is the encapsulation and personification of humility. And you came to die to break the pride and the army of sin in our lives. It isn't other people we wrestle against, it's that old enemy who's always been against you, and who's always tried to defeat you, and who never succeeds because he's already defeated. Why? Why would we stay with such an evil taskmaster? If we only knew who brings peace. He comes riding on the colt of a donkey, and he dies to make peace for us. So Lord, I pray this morning, if there's a heart here who's at war with you, in ways that I do not understand, would they surrender to your peace terms and to the God of peace. For those of us who know that peace, it becomes incumbent upon us to flesh it out every day, to be people who are peacemakers, to be spokesmen for the peace of God, compelled by the redemption of our Savior, proclaiming that peace. The war can be over. He comes riding into a town when he really wants to ride into our hearts. And we know full well who makes peace for us. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for being the King of our peace. Amen. I'll be here afterwards if you have questions, you want to talk or pray. Thank you for coming this morning.
You guys take care of yourself. Yeah, you too.
What they know if I was that's too much work.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Yeah. Somebody had to take care of Mom. I doubt it.
Then you be left alone with the baby.
Have a seat.
I won't be at Bible study today.
Okay.
We're having a big thing, so.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. I kind of wondered about that.
Yeah, and last week I couldn't, I don't know, just things are crazy, so I'm trying to get there, but.
Okay. Yeah, I was out of town last
Oh,
week. So.
okay, yeah. All right, well, I'll see you soon.
Okay.
Because I'll call him now.
No, I gotta wrap up here. Sorry, I threw that at you.
Usually it's easy, but they played around with the settings in PowerPoint last week. It wasn't showing the way I like it to show. It's really easy to go back.
Okay.
So I put it back.
I will try and do that.
Oh,
Try and
normally
give
it's
you a heads,
fine.
try and give you a heads up. What I need to do is just put it in and then use it after.
Yeah. Well, normally it's fine because it's the way I like it. Some people,
Like your other one.
yeah, but it's not as easy to go back the other way. So.
Good enough.
Yeah.
Glad you got it worked out.
Yeah. Got it figured out.
Oh, okay.
Hey, be good. You know, that's why. They're ready, set, go. guys leave. Taking care of her mother and father. Betsy had knee replacement surgery. 13th of February. She's up walking with it's her dad. Both of us together.